Hello, everybody. Welcome to the Agilistry and QA Meetup group. I'm Lynn Christensen Esker, your host for today. Thank you, everyone, for attending and joining us. As you know, obviously, we're holding a webinar today in the place of an in-person meetup. Please check back with meetup.com for future events. In addition, I'd like to tell you about another webinar put on by our sponsor, QASource, on September 12th, entitled Accelerate Your Automation with API Testing. Please visit the events section of QASource.com for more information or to register. I'm excited today to have our speaker, Melissa Tondi, joining us from Denver, Colorado in the U.S. today for our program, Finding Efficiencies in Software Testing. This is a popular presentation she has done at several industry conferences, and it's great to be able to offer this information to you today in our meetup. A little bit about Melissa. She is a testing and QE expert and frequent conference speaker. She has spent most of her career working within software testing teams. She is the founder of Denver Mobile and Quality, a board member of Software Quality Association of Denver, and a director of quality engineering at EMS Software, where she assists teams to continuously improve the pursuit of quality software from design to delivery and everything in between. In her software test and quality engineering career, Melissa has focused on building and organizing teams around three major tenets: efficiency, innovation, and culture, and has created the greatest common denominator approach for determining ways in which team members can assess, implement, and report on day-to-day activities so the gap between need and value is as small as possible. You'll be able to submit questions to Melissa today using the chat and question features on the webinar control panel. Enter your questions in the dialog box, and Melissa will address them a few different times throughout the presentation and at the end of her talk. So without further ado, let me turn the presentation over to Melissa for Finding Efficiencies in Software Testing.
Again, thank you to the Agilistry and QA Meetup and QASource for sponsoring this webinar. So today we're going to talk a little bit about finding efficiencies in software testing. And for any of you who may have heard me speak, whether it was a previous webinar through QASource or through any of our industry conferences, a lot of the content that I put together is based off of both my personal and professional experiences, as well as experiences that my colleagues have. So that's why I kind of emphasize some of the open Q&A, as Lynn had mentioned earlier. So as I go through slides, I would love for you to write those questions down, and we'll have a couple of breaks in between this particular slide deck to field your questions. And then at the end, if we have time, we'll go through any remaining questions that we didn't have time to go through. So let's talk a little bit about why me. Again, as Lynn had mentioned, she kind of read my bio, which is all very true. But specifically, I'm devoted to the quality of the overall SDLC. Quality engineering software testing is, of course, one very major component within the SDLC, but there are lots of different areas to help influence and instill quality within our overall SDLC. So although I tend to focus on the quality engineering aspect of that, I'm very interested in all aspects of quality within the SDLC. And of course, the three tenets that Lynn had mentioned earlier: efficiency, innovation, and culture. Of course, the title of this webinar gives it away that we'll be focusing mainly on efficiencies. And really, the best way to think about efficiencies and instilling them is to ensure that not only do we find the places where we may be inefficient, but that we have a plan to address those, because there should be some sort of one-to-one correlation where if we address, or in some cases remove, the inefficiencies in our day-to-day or in our overall SDLC, there should be some time gain. So what I'd like for us to really focus on is not only how can we address those inefficiencies that that I'll highlight in this particular content, but what will you do with the time saved as you address those. And we'll talk about that a little bit at the end, and I'll talk about specifically organizations that I've been a part of where we have flourished and added capabilities and service to our QE department by simply addressing these inefficiencies. So let's dive in. So why is there never enough time? You know, we've all been here. For those of you who are QA or QE professionals, we know that of all of the disciplines that are represented within our SDLC and within our project teams, QA or QE tends to have decreased schedules, whether that is based off of inefficient or incorrect estimates to begin with, or maybe non-productive work time or injections that present themselves within our sprints or within our release cycles. We tend to have decreased schedules. Another is that sometimes decisions are made in a silo. Sometimes it's pretty popular sometimes for people to want to quickly address questions, and so if you walk around the floor at some point, you may see a developer and a product owner or a business analyst hunched over one's desk, and in that conversation there may be decisions made that affect the ultimate success or the acceptance criteria of that story or that feature. And sometimes when those decisions are made in a silo and the other teams that are responsible for working or executing those stories or features are not involved, we tend to create inefficiencies and certainly decrease schedules. So you can imagine that if a decision was made between, say, a developer and a product owner that would ultimately affect the acceptance criteria, and we've written tests to test that acceptance criteria the way that it was written previously and the way that it was groomed or refined, we may be writing bugs that are inadvertent because that information never made it back to the whole team. Sometimes we wind up not having enough time because risks that were brought up or encountered during the development or sometimes testing time aren't vetted appropriately or with enough emphasis. So we may be focusing on something that is a perceived a low risk, but ultimately it may have a high risk for our customers or users to the right of us. So to make sure that we're vetting those risks not only at the time of, say, grooming or refinement or planning, but throughout the cycle. So when we start our dev work, when we finish our dev work, when we start and finish our design and start and finish our testing work, making sure that we are appropriately vetting those risks as they come up. And then in a lot of ways, and I'm actually seeing this decrease but some of you may be experiencing the stuff that's right now, that test or the QA or QE team may not have an appropriate seat at the table, and seat is kind of quoted here because, again, if you kind of look at the original example I was talking about where, say, maybe product and dev are meeting and deciding on acceptance criteria without including QE, we might not have the right voice in here. Sometimes we tend to throw things over the wall, so to speak, where QE or QA was not embedded with the team into some of those scrum ceremonies to the left of us. So these are some of the areas that I've seen over the course of my career over the last few years. And again, as I've talked with other people in other companies, they've also experienced this. And of course, you may have your own list. There's always a myriad of reasons why there seems to never be enough time for us to really implement what we feel we should, and without properly addressing some of these areas that I discussed and others that we'll go through within this presentation, we tend to be squeezed at the end of a release or at the end of a sprint and never quite really getting to the point where we can all nod our heads in agreement that we've done the absolute best job within the best time that we can. So let's move into some of the activities from a QE standpoint, from a project standpoint, that we emphasize, right? And a lot of these should sound very familiar to you, especially if you are in an agile environment. We tend to emphasize, and rightfully so, test planning and management. And one of the questions that I would love for you guys to think about is, right now, what is your ratio of test planning and management versus execution? And you don't necessarily have to answer those at the point, but I'd love for you to think about that. And I'll talk about a ratio that we've put in place over the last 4 years that tends to put more emphasis on the execution versus the planning and management piece. We plan stories by vetting out those requirements or acceptance criteria, right? So we put a lot of emphasis on ensuring that the requirements and the acceptance criteria are vetted out beforehand. But sometimes we don't necessarily have a good way to vet out those requirements or AC that may have changed once the work actually starts. So we tend to put way more emphasis on the planning, but not necessarily of the interruptions that cause those originally best laid plans to maybe not be as valid as they once were. We also tend to emphasize testing of the story's acceptance criteria or requirements straight up, which is also a very valid request and exercise from a well-established and professional QE department. But one thing is that we tend to test these first because they're the easiest. Generally, if we're doing things correctly, stories that we are working off of should have acceptance criteria, or for those of you who aren't working off of stories, you may have really nice, well-documented requirements that could tend to drive the work that's coming out of all of our counterparts that have responsibilities to deliver a final quality product. And we tend, from a testing standpoint, we tend to emphasize these first. So think about it for those of you who are agile. When we get a story that crosses through our tool of choice, whether it's Jira or TFS or Rally or some of the other tools that are out there, we tend to execute the acceptance criteria or requirements first because those are what presents itself first via the use of test cases, or in some ways traceability matrices or other tools like that. And again, rightfully so, we should certainly be testing the requirements, but what I'd like us to think about is maybe that shouldn't be the first thing that we test when we get a story, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on as well. We talk about of course, finding and writing up bugs. And of course, that's a very pertinent and important piece of what we do as testers and quality engineers. We find and write up bugs. And of course, then we report on our testing activities. So these are areas that once we plan and once we engage within project teams and projects themselves, these are areas from an overall testing standpoint that we tend to emphasize. And again, these are all really good, but when we start looking at not only efficiencies, major efficiencies, and we start looking at micro efficiencies, when we look at saving seconds and minutes out of our day that eventually roll up into minutes and hours and sometimes weeks, we can find areas at the micro level that we tend to emphasize, and by simply shifting the emphasis from either a timing or a comprehensive solution, we can find ways for us to be efficient and even more efficient. And again, kind of going back to the theme of this, not only do we want to identify the areas that we may be inefficient, but we want to replace those inefficiencies with more valuable activities, or in some ways expand our initial offerings in there. All right, so let's move into kind of the meat of this. So let's talk, so as we go through some of the activities that we tend to emphasize, where do we find inefficiencies? So in some ways, test planning and test management, and those two words should be familiar. Some of you may use those interchangeably, some of you may not use those interchangeably, but when I talk about test planning and management, the management piece specifically is actually writing those test cases up front, and sometimes we use tools like traceability matrices or something similar, but really what we do is it's really kind of what and how are we going to test what we're eventually going to be given here. And whether we break those down at the story or the function or the feature level, generally we use some sort of set of test cases, and those test cases are expected to be comprehensive to test all of the permutations, flows, and integration points within that particular piece of software that we're given. So we tend to write sometimes very detailed test cases. If you've ever heard of the term We write them to detail that anyone off of the street can execute those. That has been sort of a mantra in a lot of companies that I've worked with, where you want to ensure that if you're onboarding lots of people, or if you're expecting some attrition, or if you work in some offshore outsourced models where tests are given to our offshore outsourced counterparts, we need to make those very detailed. And again, not necessarily the wrong way, but when I've talked with lots of people who have emphasized very detailed test cases, you're looking at test management percentages over the whole course of all of our testing activities over 50%. And I would, that's one area that we can look at how much is enough when we are writing our test cases. Some of you may have test case reviews where there's a formal meeting where those test cases are reviewed by your counterparts. And those meetings may be 30 minutes, or in some cases I've seen those be half-day meetings. And so, and not necessarily that test case reviews are not a valuable exercise, but is the amount of time that we're spending reviewing test cases at the team level the best use of our time? And then some of you may have test cases as separate document, or excuse me, test plans as a separate document. You may need to present a test plan document in addition to actual test cases. In some areas where you may be highly regulated, that would certainly be something that you would need to emphasize. But in some cases, and certainly in companies that I've worked with over the last several years, we've done away with the test plan as a separate document because we knew that generally the value that that document was providing was very, very isolated, and the time that was being spent writing it was not worth the value that it actually provided to the rest of the team. Not necessarily saying that everyone can immediately stop writing test plans, but that might be something that you would look to as your organization on the value and whether or not it's truly needed. And in that case, you would look at that time being spent and filling that with something more valuable. Another area that we find inefficiencies is duplicating testing efforts. So I like to say you would give credit where credit is due, but have we actually talked to the developers as far as what each of them is doing as part of their own checks and balances? And we'll talk a little bit about some things that we've put in place, again, over the last few years where I was kind of seeing the inefficiencies and then trying to address those. Lots of time, there are duplicated testing efforts simply because we haven't had that conversation on what dev is doing on their end as a result of some code reviews or peer reviews or just individual testing. And we tend to emphasize those easier tests that roll into the acceptance criteria and the requirements versus emphasizing the areas that were not covered to begin with. So my encouragement would be that if you don't know your devs, either individually or as a team, ask those questions so that you know exactly what is happening on your dev team standpoint and what they're testing, and make sure that we don't have the redundancy happening, but that we have a more comprehensive testing solution. And then who else is or should be testing, and find out what they're doing. You may have a very engaged product owner that is constantly testing those stories and features as they're coming to test, or sometimes in conjunction with the dev. I would encourage the same type of relationship building and questioning of who is actually testing this product outside of the testing team, and see if there are ways that you can bridge the gap and focus your initial efforts on areas that were not previously covered by the people to the left of you, like dev and like product and like design. So where else do we find inefficiencies? We tend, and I can speak this because I've been in this industry for a very long time, we tend sometimes to be an enabler, or also known as the martyr, with schedule or scope creep. Lots of times, and I certainly have been guilty of this in my career, if a sprint ends and we don't, we haven't completed all of the dev work to begin with, and it's the last day day of the sprint and we don't have time to complete everything within a normal working day, sometimes we make that decision upon ourselves to work those late hours and work those weekends. And I remember many times where I would look up on a Friday afternoon or sometimes over the weekend, and I would be the only one trying to shoulder completing all of the testing activities within the sprint because the dev work or the design work wasn't ready within that same within the commitments that the team had made, right? And so that's what makes us as testers and QEs great at what we do, is that we will give our all to make sure that the schedule and the sprint is kept up. But in some ways that may be looked at as an enabler, where we may be enabling poor or inefficient behavior to the left of us without having the team shoulder all of the success of that. And so one of the terms that we use is, if one fails, we all fail, and if one succeeds, we should all succeed in there. Sometimes we tend, from a test and QA standpoint, to take that enabler or martyr characteristics, and instead of learning the lessons from how things happen, we ensure that the project doesn't fail, and sometimes we shoulder that responsibility on our own. And so remember, in order for Agile Scrum methods to work efficiently, all team members' work needs to be accounted for. And more importantly, it should be evenly distributed across each day of the sprint. And we'll talk a little bit more about that of some things when we do capacity planning and all that, of how we can make sure that that's accurate. And so if we have a 10-day sprint with a 7-hour day, we ultimately have 70 hours of work within there. Well, sometimes we can't put all 70 hours over the course of 2 days. There simply aren't enough hours in the day. But really, we want to make sure that we are being accurate and realistic with what those work hours look like across the duration of the entire sprint. So the martyr and the enabler characteristics that are so great for us sometimes tend to enable and support inefficiencies to the left of us. So other ways that we find inefficiencies is multiple testing environments. I've gone into many companies where the lower environments from production and the expectation from our test team to test on those has been somewhere between 4 and 6 environments, which means that if we don't have an enterprise-wide test automation strategy that is almost completely automated, that means that we as testers may be testing on many environments. And so I don't necessarily have a great solution to this, except we should be asking these certainly these two first questions. How many is too many? Is there truly a need for more than 1 or 2 lower environments before we get into production? And if so, are we tailoring that type of testing on those environments to make up for the gaps or deficiencies between those environments, or are we simply running the same subset of tests across those environments without really taking into consideration the purpose of those environments and the differences between those environments and ultimately production, which is where customers and users are going to be consuming what we're delivering to them. So keep an eye out on the number of environments and make sure that we're at least asking those questions of the value and the purpose. So where else do we find the inefficiencies? QE only or QA only sprints or cycles. It's somewhat common where we may have 1 or 2 sprints when we get ready for release that are QE only or QE hardening. And not necessarily that that's a bad thing, but when we tend to have to bake in sprints worth of hardening or QE only sprints or cycles, that means that something probably wasn't planned, or that we didn't go back and address incorrect or higher estimates than what we had originally planned for. A rule of thumb that I like to say is anytime there's more than 2 days within a sprint where QE and Dev are not working together, tends to be a flag for some of the teams that I've been working on. And I'll go into a little bit more detail when we talk about addressing these inefficiencies. But that's a good rule of thumb, and that tends to handle when we should start looking at work coming in from dev for those of you who are sprint driven, and more importantly, if there are QE only sprints or cycles, the question would be, what is dev doing during that time? If they are getting started on the next sprint or the next cycle of work, that means that for every day that we are not coupled with them, that is a day that we will have to make up. And so what we tend to do is when we roll over dev only work, we tend to have that gap between dev and QE greater at the end of each sprint if we don't address those within the sprints themselves. So the rule of thumb of 2 days is one, not necessarily that every company may be able to adhere to, but it at least gives you a good indicator of the health of dev and QE being coupled together within those sprints. So where else do we find inefficiencies? We don't necessarily take advantage of all the Agile or Scrum ceremonies that exist. We tend to have probably all 3 of these: planning, stand-ups, and retros, for those of you who are operating within an Agile approach, are pretty familiar to you. And those are all pretty self-explanatory. We have others. Some of you may have grooming and refinement. Some of you may have kickoffs or sprint zero, but those tend to be the ones that if you call yourself Agile, you're doing some flavor of those 3 or more within those ceremonies. So with that said, before we talk about moving in and addressing those inefficiencies, I'm going to pause there and see if there are any questions that I might be able to answer.
Hi, Melissa. We don't have any questions right now. Audience, we'll have a final Q&A session at the end where we'll address any of the questions that you might have. I urge you to submit some questions while you have Melissa here on the webinar. In the meantime, Melissa, please take it away, and we'll finish doing questions at the end.
All right. Okay. So, all right. So now the meat of this, and I'm gonna, I kind of talk a little bit about this. This is really how do we fix them? So we've identified kind of the 4 or 5 inefficiencies, areas that we tend to emphasize not only within QE, but within our Agile teams, and areas that we might want to start looking at. So now we kind of drill down into these more micro efficiencies. So things that may take us seconds or minutes to do, and we do those throughout a week or throughout a sprint or throughout a release, they can add up to, in some cases, many hours, and in rare cases, but certainly important cases, they may roll up into weeks worth of work that we may be able to be way more efficient. So let's talk a little bit about how do we fix them. So if we go back to test planning or test management, the rule of thumb that I always like to have is always be testing. Now, of course, that's not always going to be true, but it's a nice mantra because we know that our value of testers is we emphasize the value of us actually testing, and that could be testing in either a scripted way or an unscripted way. And when I say unscripted, that could be taking the form of exploratory or ad hoc type of testing. But the more that we can emphasize the activity of testing itself, the more we will be able to step in and be that user advocate that we really should be. And I've, one of the last presentations that I actually did for the Agilistry and QA Meetup was talking about kind of the pendulum of software testing. And there's a fine balance between being able to embrace and use technology, so having that technical acumen, but also balancing that as the user advocate. And for those of you who may be interested in those slides, I'd be happy to share those with you. But really, we talk about always be testing, but making sure that we're both productive and efficient in that execution. And for those of you who may be technology adverse or who aren't early adopters and embracers of technology, tools and technology are there to ensure that we can be as productive and as efficient as possible. So we talk about always be testing, but there's also, of course, emphasis that should be done on context-driven and risk-based testing approaches for when we plan and strategize our test execution. But the more we can emphasize the testing and increase the amount of time that we're testing, the better position we will be when we finally get to release that final product. So I talk about the 10-80-10, and this is the only ratio I like. For those of you who may know me or have talked to me in the past, I tend to get asked this question, as I think a lot of us do, of what ratio do I like to see when I'm looking at a dev/QA ratio. My almost always canned answer to that is I don't ever like to have a ratio of the number of testers to the number of devs. So I've kind of stopped that ratio, and that's not actually how I staff and build teams. But the ratio that I do like is the 10-80-10. And what that means is about 10% of our time should be spent on test management, writing the tests, writing the test cases. 80% of our time should be spent executing and testing, whether, again, we're testing and executing in a scripted or an unscripted scenario. And then about 10% of our time being spent on reporting, and that includes bug and defect reporting, as well as metrics on any type of test management. If you're being held to a metric of how many tests have been executed, what's the pass-fail rate, all that. But this, as you can see, the 80% is really what I think has been a really nice ratio to look. And again, you may not be able to get there. In some ways, this might be a somewhat utopian type of ratio, but it's a good stretch goal for those of you who may be wildly different. If you're spending 40 to 60% of your time, like some organizations that I've spoken with tend to do, on test management, writing the actual tests, to where it is interfering with your test execution, you may want to look at, are you writing tests in too much detail to where you could pull that up a couple of levels. But that 10-80-10 is a ratio that I tend to hopefully build into new organizations or consult on. And of course, that kind of don't overthink it. Really, the more relationship building and the more conversations and collaboration you can do within your project team to determine how much detail is enough in your test planning and test management is going to save a lot of time in the end, especially if you don't necessarily have, or if you have self-managed people that are looking at your tests that you're creating up front versus having a test case review or formal meeting. We really just want to make sure that the detail that we're providing is truly valuable to most, if not all, members of the team, versus having one or a couple of people have their opinion on how much time should be spent on that test planning. Beautiful test cases and detailed test cases don't necessarily equate to a good test strategy. All right, so we talk about duplicating testing efforts. As I mentioned earlier, is get to know your dev, get to know your dev team. If you don't have access into what dev standards are for their unit testing, their code reviews, their peer reviews, ask those questions. Lots of times I've seen unit tests that are executed, especially for those developers who have very good practices under their belt. Those unit testing sometimes may be duplicates or redundant from some of the automated or non-automated testing efforts that we're doing to begin with. So the more insight you can have into what dev is doing on their end from both a unit testing and an individual type standpoint, you can make sure that you can have that oversight into all of the testing that's happening and have the responsibility over filling the gaps between what dev is doing on their end, what a good, well-engaged PO is doing on their end, what designers and some of the other areas are doing. We want to remove the redundancy, make sure that that testing plan is covered in some way. And our best way, and a way for one of us to show our value as professionals, is to make sure that we are filling the gap between that overall testing effort. So if we're not accounting for testing that's happening outside of the formal QE or QA team, that's one area that we can really emphasize to make sure that we're, again, not duplicating things that are going on to the left of us. One way that we've done this is we've, in the last couple of companies, we've implemented, we've kind of stolen the term of definition of done, which tends to be a practice that tends to relate to stories, user stories themselves, or acceptance criteria. Each of our disciplines here, so our kind of pillars of our Agile team, are made up of development, Scrum Master, Product Owner, QE, and UX. And each one of those disciplines has their own definition of done that we present at every project kickoff, so that we are, number one, making those public to say when we move something, when we say we are done, when dev says they are done, here is what done means to them. And we put that out in front of the team so that, again, it's not an individual piece, but it's kind of an agreement. Some of you may call that a rule of engagement or agreements, that team agreements. We tend to call it definition of done, and each discipline representative has the opportunity to present their definition of done at those kickoffs, and those definitions of done then become artifacts within the project team. So if one of those things that dev or QE or product has agreed to do isn't done, we don't have to get into that sometimes controversial or acrimonious relationship where we have to tend to point fingers at that. They've made it public that they're going to do this, and if they don't, it's their responsibility to ensure that they are monitoring and self-managing themselves versus pushing that all onto the QA or QA team, who tend to be, in some organizations, looked at as the mistake finders. And that's the one business that we want to get out of. We are not there to police or to enforce things that should have and should be done to the left of us. Our job is to test and to execute the plan of ensuring that we are making sure that our users are having a delightful experience once we get that through. And by employing industry standards around testing, we don't really have the time to be everyone else's mistake finders. And so by kind of putting that out publicly and having each discipline present what their definition of done means, that means we can always go back to that and reference that throughout the sprints and releases. Then we talk about acceptance criteria. Again, we tend to, once we move a story, and just use the JIRA example, might be in development, and then once that story is done, it moves into the column of in test or verification or whatever you title that. We tend to test the acceptance criteria first, because that's kind of human nature. I'm looking at this story, I'm just going to make sure that this AC is met. We spend so much time ensuring that that acceptance criteria is met, but what we've done is we've done lots of studies with developers. Part of what a good developer is doing is they're actually testing that acceptance criteria on their own. So this kind of goes back to the duplicating of testing efforts. And so what we've done is we've actually built into the development definition of done that is part of their code and peer review. Their code reviewer counterpart will actually go through the acceptance criteria of that story to ensure that it is it's met, so that when QE gets that story, we don't actually have to redundantly test that again. We spend our time more exploring, doing exploratory testing at the story level before we ever go through the AC. And once an AC is not met, and it's very blatant that it's not met, that kind of goes through an exception where a process where the developers then know that they need to fix something within their process and practice. But the key is that we made it public to the team that development would be doing this as part of their own practice, and it removes the responsibility from us, and sometimes, again, that kind of controversial standpoint where we are uncomfortable pointing the finger, that kind of naturally bubbles out. All right, so how do we fix being the martyr? So of course, we've always employed, I'm a huge fan of risk-based and context-driven approaches, and if you're not familiar with those terms, you can certainly do Google searches, but there are lots of industry and thought leaders that have lots to say on those. We've employed those approaches for many years in organizations that I've been in there, but the idea is that know what gives when the schedule won't, right? So we know that the best laid plans sometimes aren't able to be executed, and it's not preventing those, and it's not putting more emphasis on the planning more more so than the actual work that's being done, but it's making sure that there's a forum and format to address when things that were not planned for inject themselves. We sometimes call that injection work, or sometimes we just call that things that happen that we never could have planned, the unknowns. The idea is that, again, as I mentioned earlier, and I kind of call it be a musketeer, all for one and one for all. The more that we can get into the concept that the team itself, regardless of the role, is responsible for the commitment and overall completion of all of the work, the more that we can embrace the fact that if one person or part fails, it's our responsibility to self-manage ourselves as a team to fix that failure, and to hopefully learn and not repeat those failures, but it's to fail early and often. And by making sure that we as a team are committing to all of the work, versus each discipline committing to only what they're responsible for, it allows that all for one and one for all musketeer effect to really kind of flourish and blossom. We also have implemented for the last 3 years or so an 8-10 sprint. And this is, of a 10-day sprint, kind of talks a little bit about the first 2 days. And this goes back to the flag that I was talking about, where if there are more than 2 days that have gone through where there's no QE or testing that's involved, that's a slight flag, because we know that that will tend to derail or take a project that was normally healthy into the unhealthy portion. But we've tried an 8-10 sprint. So the first 2 days are spent with dev coding and getting those first high priority stories ready to go, and spending their time. And the first 2 days from a QE standpoint are us writing all of the tests, the scripted tests, for all of the work that we committed to within the sprint. The next 6 days within that 10-day sprint, we track that the stories are flowing consistently. And this really is the kind of the meat of the sprint, those 6 days. So days 3 through 8 is where those stories should really be flowing consistently. And if we know that there is a gap within the sprint, or if there's a day or two that goes by where a story hasn't flowed our way from a testing standpoint, we know that we may be, again, maybe venturing into being unhealthy and maybe unable to meet our commitment within normal working days. So again, this is kind of where the math of a 6 to 7 hour work day really comes in. We tend to use the terminology, if it takes 9 months to make a baby, it doesn't take 9 people 1 month to make a baby, right? You can't actually throw more people into having a baby. So it's kind of that same sense of, we have a 6 to 7 day work day, our work day, but we can't necessarily throw and increase the number of hours that we do. And that's kind of, again, fixes that martyr enabler standpoint. And then in that 8-10 sprint, the last 2 days are spent either swarming the rest of the testing if and when estimates weren't as accurate, or we have a delay or some sort of block or challenge of completing those stories by dev. We swarm the rest of the testing. And we also spend those on bug fixes and sprint hardening. So we've kind of just taken the reality of, coding all the way up to the end of that last day sprint, kind of removes the ability for us to be shippable at the end of that sprint. And for those of you who are practicing CI or CD, continuous integration or continuous deployment methods, an 8-10 sprint really gets us to the point where at the end of that last day of the sprint, everything there should be in a shippable state, which means that it's dev complete, it's QE complete, it's integration testing complete, and could be shipped if we needed to. So how do we fix the QE only or sprints or cycles? The first thing that I say is ask why. What has actually happened that has caused the need for one or more QE only sprints or cycles? Is it because we've had so many rollover work because the dev work was late or the UX work was late and QE just didn't have time to finish those. So we've had to roll over those stories, and the first couple of days of that next sprint are spent completing the testing work of everything for the previous sprint. What is the need for that? There are ways for us to be very efficient and build in those types of hardening tasks within the sprint themselves, and to have the whole team be responsible for getting that sprint to the point where it's shippable. I talk about the ABC rule, which is always be coupled with dev. And again, that goes back to if there are 2 days that have gone through where there's not a dev and QE coupling, or we're waiting for more than 2 days for work to come our way, something may need to be fixed. We may need to write those stories smaller. We may need to put more emphasis on some dependency planning. We may need to reach out to other teams to see where those bottlenecks are. But anything more than 2 days should be looked at as a flag and watched to see if that will ultimately wind up in an unhealthy state within our sprint. And of course, use the DoD, or the definition of done, for each of the disciplines in Swarm. And I will say this is probably one of the most transformational organizational pieces that we've instilled, is that it helps align dev into what they're expected to do. It also allows the rest of the teams to know what makes up their dev practice. What are the things that dev is doing on their end to ensure that they're delivering quality work? Same thing for UX, same thing for product, same thing for QE, or for any of the other teams represented within your project team. All right, so let's talk a little bit about how we fix some of these by not taking advantage of the Agile or Scrum ceremonies. So from demos, some of the things that we've put in here is that we've actually done the demos. We tend to wait for the end of a sprint, and we have this really nice long sprint planning retro and demo at the end of a sprint, or the beginning of a sprint planning for the next sprint. And if some of you may experience half-day long sprint plannings because we've had to demo all of the work that's been completed in the sprint. We've shifted that way left. We actually demo the stories from dev. At the time that their dev work is done, we demo that acceptance criteria to both QE and PO before that is moved over, because we know that the earlier we can catch missing or ambiguous AC, is going to be less expensive and costly for the rest of the team. By only having those official demos and acceptance at the end of the sprint, we've introduced a little bit of risk where the product owner might not be able to accept that story or that feature as being complete because of all of the time that has gone through for this 2 weeks before. So we've implemented at the time of check-in and merge, there is a quick 5-minute demo or more, slightly more between dev and QE and PO. That way we're all aligned that the AC is both met and understood, and that if there is a need for us to make the AC less ambiguous or more understood by everybody, we know that that's the best way to do it, because we can immediately go back and fix it from a dev standpoint versus waiting until the very end of the sprint. We've implemented more emphasis on the refinements and grooming, what I call the meat and potatoes. And meat, not necessarily formally, because of course we want to emphasize the collaborative nature that Agile allows us to do and be, but we really talk about what actually needs to be done. And this is kind of our answer to heavy test planning and producing that test plan document. We really emphasize that and push that back to the entire team to say we meet in small working sessions, so that anyone that's responsible for that story is in a short working session, or as long as they need. But the outcomes of a refinement and grooming is that anyone that has responsibility to do work on that story is in a working session to make sure all of those questions are heard by their counterparts and being answered by either PO or Dev or QE, and they're all hearing the same answer. And that has saved us hours upon hours within our sprint, because we've moved that to the left and we're emphasizing those collaborative conversations. And each of our disciplines, Dev, QE, PO, UX, are represented. They're asking those questions that ultimately would have maybe been found out later in the cycle. So we put that emphasis early on. And so we've actually increased the time that we refine and groom work and we've in turn saved that time by having fewer planning or less time in our planning sessions, because that truly becomes the formal meeting, and we get to emphasize the retro area pieces in there. So those are the areas that we have found times, and we've addressed the inefficiencies in our team. And what we've done with that time is that we've actually been able to pull in 3 services or 3 initiatives that we never really had quite time to do for accessibility. And I've kind of, this slide here is really for you to reference. And of course, these slides will be available for you. But, you know, areas that we never quite had time to emphasize or to bring into our overall definition of done or our sprints or releases. We've had a very robust accessibility testing cycle that we normally didn't have time to do. So now we're able to ensure that we meet WCAG or guidelines for our for those users who need adaptive or assistive technology to access our product. And that's a win-win for everybody. We've also been able to shift left some of our performance testing activities that were normally saved until the very end of a release or as we were getting ready to release. We've actually been able to bake in some of those activities within the testing team within a sprint, because we've address those inefficiencies of those 5 areas that I listed before. And the third area that we've been able to really flourish and build is our functional security testing. And so we align very closely with the OWASP top 10. And I have another slide deck that I'd be happy to share that goes through some of those top 10s and areas that testers with basic or fundamental understanding of functional requirements can actually pull in some of those security type tests into their overall test plan. So what we were able to do is, by addressing those 5 areas and those inefficiencies, we were able to really focus on the emphasis and the value of us testing and actually increase our capabilities and services within our organization, so that at the end, our users had way more delightful experience than they had before. We were able to be accessible for, again, those of our users who may be coming in with assistive or adaptive technology. And we were able to actually catch some of those security and performance vulnerabilities way earlier and save the cost of finding those towards the end of the cycle. And more importantly, the testers on our team were able to increase their professional development and kind of beef up their resume by adding these 3 initiatives and other initiatives in. And it was all by simply taking the time to look at the activities that we tended to emphasize within both our QE team and the overall SDLC counterparts, and really put the emphasis on how valuable is this, and is there a way that we can find the time so that we can expand our offerings. So with that said, here's a little bit of a summary of all the things that we talked about, these inefficiencies that we tend to find from a QE standpoint and how we fix them. So with that said, I'm going to open that up for any remaining questions that might be had by you.
We do have some questions.
Okay.
Here's one. You mentioned a scenario where the product owner and a dev have made decisions that affect acceptance criteria. Can you describe ways that you have seen that have worked to ensure that QA folks are kept up to date?
Yeah, so this happens, sometimes it's simply watching. If you're co-located with your team and you tend to see a product owner and developer hunched over one of their desks and you see that there's no test representation, we've taken the kind of barging in approach where the tester will kind of just peek in and say, hey, anything that you're discussing that I should be known, that I should know about. But in cases where that's not, really convenient or where that could be impactful, the agreement that we have from the PO and dev side is that if and when discussions are made that ultimately affect the acceptance criteria, and not all of the people responsible for that were part of that discussion, it is the responsibility of those 1 or 2 people to update the rest of the team immediately after that, and to update that AC changes in the story. And in cases where that doesn't happen, we make sure that there's an exception path where we may write bugs according to outdated AC, and if those bugs are triaged by product or QE, we'll tend to bubble those up. So what we'll see is that the more bugs that we write against that story in the AC that may be outdated or ambiguous, that will tend to go back to bugs in the requirements. So we'll actually track that and label that within our bug tracking tool. And then our product team actually goes through there and they will correct and self-manage themselves to make sure that doesn't happen again. So we'll see an increase in our bug count, and then we'll do a little bit more analysis on that. And then we'll work individually with that product owner to make sure that they aren't forgetting to take that into consideration.
Thank you. Here's another. Could you describe what it looks like when QA and devs are pairing in a healthy way?
Yes. So one of I really do like the grooming and refinement sessions. I look across the room. So if you do grooming and refinements as the large team group, so say if you have 8 to 12 people on a team or more in some cases, human nature is if you're not comfortable speaking publicly in a larger forum, you will tend to stay quiet. And so what we've done is, as I was mentioning earlier, we've kind of moved those grooming and refinement sessions into smaller working sessions. If you're in a room of 12 people or so, it's easy for you, if you're not comfortable speaking publicly, to not have to say anything, and it won't cause too much, people won't necessarily, that won't flag anything. But if in a small session, if you've got 3 people in a small working session, it's much harder for you to not be verbal and vocal when vetting those out. So one thing that I look for is in those smaller working sessions where you have maybe a UX, PO, dev, and QE, or maybe just the PO, dev, and QE that's working on that story. All 3 of those people should be talking about the same amount of time, asking questions, being able to present what their high-level strategy is. And so it's harder to hide in that smaller grouping session. So that's what I tend to look for, is those smaller working sessions where dev and QE and PO are talking equally. And it's a little bit of positive peer pressure, and it tends to decrease the ability for someone to hide who maybe hasn't prepared or who doesn't feel comfortable speaking in that greater public forum.
Thank you. I think we have time for one more quick question, if you can answer it in about a minute, Melissa. Who writes test automation on your teams, and how soon do you start automating test cases?
So all of our quality engineers have test automation capability and expertise. We start writing our automated tests as soon as that sprint starts. And we have a selection criteria where our first priority of test automation meets our automation criteria and guidelines that has been defined by our technical testing teammates, our quality engineers, and that also adheres to our priority of tests, and we tend to tag those to the ISTQB definition of a smoke test, which would tend to, if that were to break or have adverse effect on production, it would result in a SEV1 or a hot fix. So all of our quality engineers have the ability to automate, so they're both automating and testing, not necessarily simultaneously, but as part of their delivery within that sprint.
Okay, thank you. That's all the time we have today for questions. But if we didn't address your questions or concerns, you can reach out to Melissa directly. I think she's got some contact information. Thank you, Melissa Tondi, for presenting such a great program.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it. Thank you to the Agilistry and QA Meetup and QASource for hosting this.
Thank you. And thanks to the audience for joining us for today for Efficiency in Software Testing. We'll be putting the link of the video up online in about a week or so. And please check back at meetup.com for the link to that and for future Meetup events. And again, we invite you to QASource's upcoming webinar, Accelerate Your Automation with API Testing, on September 12th. Check QASource.com/news-events for for more information. Thank you all and enjoy your day.
Thank you.